Daily Bible Time, good morning. It is Tuesday morning now, the 10th of January. Dominic Steele here, and we're looking through Christopher Watkin's book, Biblical Critical Theory, just taking a chapter a day, or today, the case of today, we're doing half a chapter a day, the back half of chapter 10. Just to pick up on the questions at the back of the chapter, what is remarkable about the covenant account in Genesis 15? What are our implications for a Christian view of society? How does the biblical idea of covenant diagonalize the different social contract theories of Hobbes and Rousseau? You've got 10 minutes to make an adult Sunday school presentation on the difference between the logic of equivalence and the logic of superabundance, and how they relate to the biblical idea of covenant. What key points will you include? How a society founded on the covenant logic of superabundance will differ to one founded on the contractual logic of equivalence. And how does covenant epistemology help us build a biblical understanding of what it means to know something? What we found out, though, in this chapter is that Christopher Watkin is an Avengers fan. So there's a good illustration coming up about Avengers, the end game. Now, just to recap, we were introduced yesterday at the start of chapter 10 to the whole concept of Abraham and covenant, and God making a promise, and covenant is a bigger idea than contract, and particularly significant, with covenant often, they were the big country and the vassal, the subsidiary country, and the big country, the suzerain country, would say, I will look after you, I will protect you, and you will pay lots of taxes to me. And that was really the feature of what a covenant looked like in the ancient Near East. So the big and the powerful, and the suzerain, the big and the powerful, and the dominated, the smaller. And so really when you look at the covenant that God makes with Abraham, it's got that same structure, the big and the powerful and the smaller. Although the amazing thing is that when God says, here is my covenant with you, God binds himself. He does not bind Abraham. And so it's a very one-sided covenant. It's a covenant of super generosity. And that is in contrast with the social contract of Hobbes and Rousseau. And they talk about social contract and the people and their relationship with the God. To give you the summary paragraph from Christopher Watkins, if individuals are pushed into Hobbes's contract because they're so afraid of the violent alternative, they're pulled into Rousseau's because of a positive vision for their common life and perfectibility. Whereas Hobbes's Leviathan offers the thin gruel of security, Rousseau's social contract is supposed to bring a banquet of freedom. Everyone can be free because Rousseau contentiously argues every community has a general will and reflects the true wishes. Now, the summary, and this is where we stopped yesterday, from Watkin, Hobbes and Rousseau have each grasped something of the complex biblical theory, but as with all heresies, they exaggerate and deform some aspects while neglecting others. Now, then, and this is the new section we're dealing with, Watkin introduces the contractual logic of equivalence and the covenantal logic of superabundance. And here, he's saying, in contracts, we write down, well, you do this and you do that, and there is, to quote Paul Ricoeur, an unerring calculation determining the just measure of commitment in each case. It's the logic of transaction and of the market, a reciprocal paradigm. God's covenants, by contrast, operate according to the logic of superabundance, a lavish, generous, loving paradigm of excess. God walks between the animal parts alone. The Exodus rescue precedes the Sinai law. Christ lays down his life in the new covenant in his blood. This is the logic of how much more of the Pauline epistles, the letter to the Hebrews, of going beyond the call of duty, beyond what might be right and proper, beyond what you could reasonably demand on a ledger of credit and debit. The logic of superabundance replaces the fear and submission of Hobbes's Leviathan, or the tyranny of Rousseau's general will, with the love and sacrifice of Christ. It is a logic of grace and gift. It is a divine logic. And Watkin points out the closest human equivalent to the logic of the superabundance in Genesis 12 and Genesis 15 is perhaps the wedding vow. The happy and happily naive couple make wild, limitless commitments that bind them in radical and long-lasting ways. No couple knows what they're in for when they make their wedding vows. They're not supposed to. Covenants are based on commitment, not on calculation and prenuptial agreements. Humanly speaking, if you know what you're getting yourself into, you're entering into a contract, you set the limits on the commitment, you perform a cost-benefit analysis in advance, you calculate. But Abraham has no opportunity to perform a cost-benefit analysis in advance. He knows not what he's getting himself into. He does not calculate. All he knows is that God has spoken to him and made spectacular promises, and that is enough. As for God, he commits to bless Abraham and his descendants, while knowing full well about Abraham's future disobedience and the stubbornness, idolatry, and inveterate grumbling of Abraham's descendants. That is why covenant is part of the overarching biblical figure of gratuity. It's not a market transaction, but a super abundant gift. That's where Watkin introduces his powerful illustration of Avengers Endgame, where the assembled superheroes covenant. They don't go into it as a contract. I'll put in this much effort as long as it's not going to cost me that much. They covenant unconditionally to save the universe, and it's a lovely metaphor for what's going on here. And I haven't seen that movie, but as a result of this chapter, I'm going to go and watch that movie now. Covenant epistemology, next big heading. Covenant is not just an agreement, it's a biblical figure that shapes a distinctive Christian attitude to the whole of life and knowledge. One fine example of how covenant provides a pattern for Christian understanding and engagement with the world comes from the pen of Christian philosopher Esther Meek. Meek argues that the covenant paradigm shapes how we know things. She elaborates what she calls a covenant epistemology, a distinctive way of accounting for how we'll know things that bears many of the hallmarks of the covenant paradigm. Now, for time, we're going to skip over the rest of that section, and we pick up with provision. The reassurances provided to Abraham by God evidently did not permanently set his mind at rest, and in the chapters that follow, he and Sarah go about trying to manufacture a child by their own ingenuity. That fails, using Sarah's servant Hagar. Eventually, God's promise is fulfilled. Sarah gives birth to Isaac. And then the chapter finishes from Watkin looking at the moment where Abraham sacrifices Isaac. He takes the child of the promise up to Mount Moriah to offer him as sacrifice. And interesting, and I've got to confess I wasn't aware of this, that episode, that Genesis 22 episode of Abraham sacrificing Isaac, is a key one in philosophical and theoretical discourse today, largely through Soren Kierkegaard's influence. Now, the two key literary features of the text that Watkin points out, he says the episode comes with its own meta-discourse and interpretation of the events. In the first verse, it said, God tested Abraham. So what is going on is we're told this is a test of Abraham, and that's really clear. We know from the beginning that the events are a test. And then secondly, says Watkin, at the risk of sounding like a first-year undergraduate literature lecturer, we need to pay attention to the repetitions in the text. In this case, one idea is repeated 3 times, and twice, in a rather conspicuously quick succession, Abraham answered, God himself will provide for the burnt offerings, my son. Abraham called that place, the Lord will provide. And to this day it's said, on the mountain of the Lord it will be provided. The take-home message for the events for Abraham is crystal clear. The Lord himself will provide. So it's a test, and the Lord will provide. Now, we read it, this chapter, Abraham being prepared to sacrifice Isaac, and we are shocked because we're reading it through Western eyes. Back in that time, God's expecting child sacrifice. That wasn't unknown. And that wouldn't have been the shocking idea. The great shock in that context was that God would provide. Let me read it to you. It says, this is Watkin. God's command to sacrifice Isaac makes no sense in the context of his own promises to provide Abraham with many children. Isaac is the child of the promise, supernaturally supplied by God himself, the child through whom the promise of descendants is to be realized. So the biblically literate reader is meant to cry out, what? Why? No, this makes no sense. God appears to be sabotaging his covenant purpose. The second shock, particularly acute for the ancient reader, brought up in an N-shaped, performance-based culture, is verses 12 and 13. God himself called off the sacrifice, and this is where the real scandal lies, says Watkin. God himself provides the lamb. In the tit-for-tat, sacrificial arrangements between gods and their peoples in the ancient world, sacrifices were offered to the gods in the hope of something in exchange. They were not provided by the gods. The idea that God himself will provide a lamb would have made no sense at all within this sort of culture. And it may well have made little sense to Abraham and his descendants until the time, 2,000 years later, when John the Baptist cries out in the desert of Judea, "Look, the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world." God provides. Now, Watkin then goes on to examine Kierkegaard's reading of this passage, and really, I think the big one that comes out of Kierkegaard's reading is the whole concept of leap of faith and the introduction of that idea. The difference between the tragic hero and the knight of faith is that whereas both renounce all they have, only the knight of faith makes the leap of faith. This is Watkin quoting Kierkegaard. The great leap whereby I pass into infinity. It's unclear what precisely this leap consists of, but Johannes repeats a number of times that faith requires passion. Passion is divorced from reflection, and so it is essentially a leap. And to summarise at the end of the chapter, in Kierkegaard's account, we have a deep analysis of, and indeed the blueprint for, what our culture often understands by faith. Of course, Kierkegaard's overriding aim in his book Fear and Trembling is not to be the careful biblical exegete sensitive to the original cultural context of the book of Genesis and the passage's self-interpretation. He is interacting with the Abraham narrative in order to inform and shape his own philosophical position. Nevertheless, although Kierkegaard's leap of faith has become the most common picture of faith today, it is profoundly at variance with the biblical account. So that is Christopher Watkin on Abraham and covenant, and it's so helpful, isn't it? Hearing how the Bible interacts with, philosophical terms that we have become familiar with, like leap of faith. Fascinating to see that Kierkegaard in the end got it from Abraham, but only got it from Abraham by misinterpreting Abraham. Thanks for joining us on Daily Bible Time today. Look forward to your company tomorrow morning when we're going to be looking at Moses and the whole question of the law. Cheers. God bless.